I'm Joseph Kopser, and I'm joined by Brett Boyd. Welcome to the latest web series video by Grayline talking about power. In the news, you hear a lot about power and energy, renewables, carbon-based fuels, oil, natural gas, and nuclear. But there is a catalyst occurring with power that is making rapid changes that are going to take us into the future in a way that many people can't imagine today. You see, power used to be always consumed and delivered on site, whether it was from a windmill on a farm or whether it was fire created right there in the company of that whatever tribe or group of people it was. But as we became more dense, we began to master power, and then we were able to distribute it on wide, large networks. But the future of power is actually going to be redistributed in a way that concentrates it again with all new ways to think about how it impacts the private sector and the public sector and every human in terms of how we interact with power and energy. So Brett, big picture, what are the things going on in this catalyst of power that we talk about?
Yeah, I mean, look, in general, we're talking about renewable energy. And I'm very aware that that's a topic that's been politicized, that's been talked about as the next great thing for years, and that is something that probably a lot of people have different views on this. And I guess our core thesis is the idea that renewables, this is primarily solar and wind power, is nearing the inflection point, actually at the inflection point in some cases, of being cheaper than traditional fossil fuel-based power. This is coal and natural gas primarily in the United States. And that's going to matter, right? So this is something where we see, again, we've seen the cost curves on these technologies go down for a long time. We've seen a lot of subsidies programs and a lot of these different things, but on an unsubsidized basis, these technologies are about to be cost competitive or have a cost advantage from traditional power generation. And in our understanding of how economic systems work, that will actually drive adoption, as opposed to wishful thinking, as opposed to government regulations forcing people to do different things. And it's interesting to see how that's evolved. It's actually happening, in our view here, as a result of batteries. So you have of the components here, you've got, so take solar and wind. So the photovoltaic cell is the core solar power technology. And when you look at the cost curves and how they've come down over time, solar power in many cases is cost competitive with coal and gas. Similarly, wind turbines, big turbines, wind farms can be standalone or can be giant farms. The cost curves on those and the efficiency metrics on those has also come down over time, which has created an environment where wind in many cases is cost competitive with traditional power.
But we know that the sun doesn't shine every day and the wind doesn't always blow.
Absolutely. And so
batteries.
Leveling is the issue here, and the solution for that is batteries. And battery technology is incredibly complicated. There's a lot of different ways to look at this, but at a very high level, Tesla and others who have poured billions of dollars into making more efficient batteries more cheaply for electric vehicles, like those developments, that technology is spilling over into grid storage battery solutions, which is going to really make this work. And again, there are a lot of determinants. In no situation do renewables entirely take over traditional fossil fuel-based power generation in the United States, at least in the near future. And it is also important to note that we're primarily talking about electricity generation as opposed to transportation fuel. Those are two different things. In the US right now, the electricity generation breakdown is something around 15% are renewables right now. I believe coal is maybe 30%, gas is around 30%, and nuclear is around 20%. But we see that 15% renewables increasing dramatically. And importantly, when renewables become economically viable, as you mentioned, it changes the dynamics of power. It changes the economics of power. It changes the relative value of different types of productive assets, which I'd like to get into a little bit. And it's another one of these that is important regardless. Of course, if you're in the power business, you're probably thinking about this a lot. And we've obviously seen a lot of investment in renewables by the large oil and gas exploration companies, for example. But this is an issue that really broadly affects government and business in far more than you would think at first glance.
So if I'm a government with jurisdiction over a large piece of land, or I'm a company that owns a large piece of land and maybe I have a large warehouse and a lot of vehicles, what does this catalyst that's occurring in power mean to our organization?
Well, let's talk about the government piece first, because there is both a challenge and an opportunity here. Because in general, we think about the relative value of productive assets, right? So in order to generate revenue, in order to generate a resource that other people will pay for here, you don't have to build a power plant anymore. You can actually, in a modular fashion, say, hey, let's put PV panels on top of our trucking fleet or on top of our buildings, and as this evolves, those will become more productive and more efficient. It's an interesting challenge for the regulatory system, because again, we've got a system where somebody generates power, somebody else sells power, and a whole lot of people buy power. And what we're looking at here is an environment where a whole lot of people sometimes buy power, sometimes sell power, sometimes store power, and there's this whole ecosystem that's going to need to evolve. And again, this is a reasonably highly regulated environment, so it'll take some policy innovation and so on, but it's a neat opportunity. I mean, what does it mean when roads, they have photovoltaic roads in Europe and China have both pioneered these, and it's, what does that mean when these are productive assets, and how does one think about the value of different aspects of, again, their business or their mandate as a public institution?
And then in terms of infrastructure, so you're saying that in the future, a large company or even a person's home could be a point where the power is being generated, the power is being stored, and potentially everyone is actually able to sell that power on the market. And so we go from a centralized power generation going out to now decentralized power generation, storage, and then production.
Yeah, and another application, you're absolutely right, another application that I get excited about is think of the quandary that developing nations have faced forever, right? So the cost of entry to provide power for your people is got to build a big plant. Well, if you don't have enough money, you end up buying, and you have these large facilities, and you essentially have to build excess capacity that you expect to grow into, and then when you've maxed that out, you then have to make another huge investment in a large plant. Like what an opportunity to say, look, let's build a local facility that's enough for what we need, and we'll just add little modules to it as we go. And you can't do that with a nuclear plant, right? You can't just like add another module here and take one down and so on. You have to make 30 to 50-year commitments, and it seems like that's a neat opportunity, this whole modularity and scalability that applies. I mean, I use the developing nation example, but it applies to businesses and communities. And I mean, what does it mean when the grid decentralizes effectively?
Right. So looking forward to the future of power, we have a lot to think about, not only as a private sector, but also those in the public sector. From the standpoint of geopolitics, what is it going to mean between different nations, those that are producing power and those that are consuming that power? What is that going to mean on the very smallest scale, where, as mentioned, remote location, remote villages now have the ability to produce their own power, store it, to be able to power refrigerators that keep medicines safe, that be able to keep food overnight for longer periods of time, and that's distributed all throughout a population. So there's lots of things about this catalyst of power and how it impacts both the public and the private sector. And so find more from our website about how companies and organizations and public sectors decide what's important after they see all these changes, and then figure out how they're going to execute those changes. That's what we do at Grayline. There's all kinds of opportunities and other videos on our website. We encourage you to tune in, check out the other sites, and give us your feedback. Thank you very much.